I'm Chief Security Officer for Huawei in the United States. I've been in this role for 10 years this summer. So I've had quite an interesting perspective over these years. I think the emerging challenges that we're seeing in cybersecurity are really going along with the evolution of technology. As we move into an intelligent digital world, we've recently, in the last year or so, we've seen some cyber attacks where so-called trusted vendors were violated. We need, as a global community, not just governments, but as a global community, we need to collaborate to help bring the technologies to the people and the organizations of the world. But we also need to collaborate in terms of figuring out how do we assess and manage the risk in the world to cybersecurity and privacy. And so I don't see it as one country blocking another country. The fact is, it's really best if there are global standards, certification programs for critical equipment. There should be independent testing of key components, because fundamentally, as we move into the fourth industrial revolution, we are getting into technologies where you have sensor to sensor, sensor to machine, machine to machine communications, automation, automatic responses that will increasingly be affected by big data analytics, by artificial intelligence. And so we as a global community are really going to become much more dependent on these technologies, information communication technologies, these 5G enabled technologies for our individual health and safety, for organizational safety and wellness, government services, for clean energy, for smart farming, intelligent manufacturing, all those things. So we have to collaborate to make sure that we as a global community have an objective and transparent basis for knowing that the products and services that we are using or going to consider using are worthy of trust, and they're going to be resilient, that they're going to be there when we need them to be there. And if you can have global standards and global conformance programs, it helps promote the ability to generate competition, because competition can encourage and create greater innovation, it can reduce costs, and it can promote greater security. So if we can work together in that sense, then we can move forward for the benefit of all. I think there's an awful lot happening around the world, but we have to recognize that the major bad guys in the world, the major nation states, they have the ability to hack into everybody. So we have to have this, as I said, an objective and transparent basis for knowing that the products and services are worthy of trust and they're going to be there when we need them, that we can in fact depend on them.
And what keeps you up at night for the year 2022 in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, I'm not sure that anything particularly keeps me up at night, fortunately, but to the point that you're raising, we have to recognize it's not just that there are all kinds of cyber attacks and the bad guys are getting more sophisticated, which they are. It's that as the technology evolves, as we move toward the full standalone 5G, where it goes beyond simply speed and goes to the number of connections, the lag time, the ability to bring computing power to the edge, that we are talking about transformation of our way of lives for the good. But we have to make sure we work together to address the risk at the same time, because we really are going to depend on this stuff a lot more. So that's the downside of the great things that this technology promises to bring to the world, and hopefully to reduce poverty in the world. But if we don't work together to address the risk, we may be worse off. I see an awful lot of commitment by a lot of people around the world to try to move to the point where there are independent standards and best practices. There's conformance and testing programs with adequate transparency, so you can tell whether or not the major suppliers, the major operators are doing what they need to do to conform to those requirements. And hopefully the global cyber norms of conduct can also be strengthened, so there can be some consequences for non-conformance.
And do you believe all the respective national information security agencies, even the labs, have even the capacity and experts to do all these evaluations and certifications in a thorough way, given the absolute massive volume of products that are connected and where you are not clear about supply chain, where you don't really know where the software code comes from. Is that even possible? Is this not something that everybody talks about, but they don't know what this actually means in reality?
Well, it's certainly not a single touch point or checkpoint, as you know. We have standards for different kinds of products and services. We have models, such as the Common Criteria model, which I think there were 70 or more certified labs around the world, where you have a pretty good level of assurance that the testing will be similar, the certifications will be similar, and that's a very good thing. We see in certain markets, telecommunications, for example, the path forward of governments and private companies and experts working together with GSMA and 3GPP to develop 5G standards that are meaningful based on the current threat environment, and that those standards will continue to evolve as 5G rolls out, as the use cases of 5G roll out. And then you see more specifically in the telecom equipment part of the communications supply chain, you see the NESIS, the Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme, that the operators, the major customers, we and our competitors have all worked together to come up with those standards. It's the first level of assurance, of course, and we have to work toward higher levels of assurance. And you have the early stages of getting certified labs, to your point, that are qualified and capable to do that kind of testing. But that's part of what has to evolve. That's part of what's going to require a commitment by the companies, the operators, experts, and governments to say, this is what we need so that we have this objective and transparent basis for knowing what's worthy of trust. There are also certain things that are of the most critical, most sensitive nature, where governments are going to say they're going to be an extra level of security. So some of the components of the American president's plane, Air Force One, have special components where even the semiconductors might be created in a special trusted lab environment so that there cannot be any tampering of that. But the global community has to look together and say, okay, what is the real risk? What are the potential consequences? And what are the costs involved? And so that's why if we assume that the bad guys can hack into everybody, the ability to move toward and the requirements to move toward a zero trust environment where you have multiple verification and certification, not just at the perimeter, but throughout in terms of access and in terms of the devices, in terms of the business case and what it's being used for. That zero trust environment, those methods for certification and verification become all the more important. I think we're on a path to get there. But hopefully the global community will say, well, in certain things, such as telecommunications, we could set up, meaning the global community, independent regional testing labs for major components to be tested. And there need to be requirements where the operators have the ability to have a special relationship with these suppliers, such as Huawei and our competitors, a special relationship where they would have greater access and greater visibility into what we do and how we do it. The kind of access that no company, nor our competitors, would give that kind of access to governments, but that kind of access to the operators. So they have an ability to know whether what we're doing is conforming to the requirements. Presumably there are contractual requirements, service level agreements to make sure that these things are being done. But some of the aspects that we take for granted within our company, but the global community needs to focus on, things like, well, if a telecom equipment supplier has the contract with an operator to do the updates to service the equipment, there need to be policies, processes, and technologies that are recognized that can help make sure that whether, when, and how the equipment supplier accesses the customer networks and the customer data is done in a way that's under the complete supervision of the operator, that's completely verifiable, that the sessions are completely auditable, completely recorded. So that way we have confidence that no one is improperly accessing the data, no one has put in backdoors, nobody, and I think a lot in the community think that the problem of updates is something that's even a greater problem than backdoors, although you have to test for those. But the fact that there are and there need to be these kinds of requirements and processes to verify and test the updates that go into certain equipment. We have to recognize, for example, that telecom equipment is quite different than some of the updates in a DevOps kind of environment where you're having all these updates and automatically deployed. It's done very different in the telecom sector, but that is the kind of thing that governments and experts need to have visibility into and there needs to be the independent testing requirements, hopefully consensus-based standards. And so that's one of the reasons I'm encouraged that the U.S. government has indicated that they want to get more involved in 5G standards. And I think that is absolutely significant. And as an American, I hope they'll also provide some funding for American companies, American experts, to also participate in the various standards efforts, because I think having that kind of diverse expertise and that consensus-based approach is what's going to help us manage the risk and move forward and get the full benefits of the technology.
Two more questions. The first one is, did the US and Europe miss out on the, let's say, R&D race in terms of 5G, given especially where Huawei is with their 5G equipment? That's question one. And then the second question is, do you think 5G, if it's really rolled out and it's ubiquitous, significantly increases the attack surface from a cyber tech perspective, or is it not that much of a big concern?
Well, when you talk about whether the U.S. has missed out, and I think there's been quite a bit of discussion, and there's a lot of assumptions, and the assumptions may be correct. I'm not sure that they are. When you talk about the kinds of products that we and Nokia and Ericsson and others sell, the competition between us as suppliers is quite different than whether or not a country like the U.S. is working with its operators and its customers to help drive forward the technology so that the full benefits of 5G can be realized, in this case by the United States, by the citizens, by the operators, by government services. And I think some in the U.S. assume that the fact that the U.S. doesn't have a major telecom equipment supplier means in some sense the U.S. is losing out. And I don't think that's a fair statement at all. And I don't know whether the United States needs a telecom equipment supplier. Some assume that the U.S. does. I'm not so sure. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'd like to see a private sector-led technology industrial strategy to look at such questions. But the ability of America to say, what kind of collaboration is necessary? What are the various business cases that can make the most sense? What are the kinds of rules on spectrum allocation so that the operators don't spend so much money to buy the spectrum, they don't have the money to roll out the full-fledged technology? I think there is also a lack of understanding or incomplete understanding about what 5G is. And obviously, as we talked about before, the speed is very, very important, but the latency, the lag time, the ability to connect multiple connections, the ability to bring the computing power to the edge and to be able to access so much from the cloud, these are the kind of things that's important to a country to really drive forward as we need to in the future. One of the problems in the United States, you take an example from long ago of, there are not high-speed trains in the United States. And there isn't the real full 5G of the kind we're talking about that you see, for example, in major parts of China, South Korea, and some other places. We're just used to having phones that have, faster download and faster uploads in certain geographic areas. But the full benefits to our industrial sectors, to our government, are yet to be realized. But we don't see it. When we as a people don't see it, like we haven't really experienced, most of us haven't experienced the great high-speed trains like we have in Europe, like you have in Japan. And so we don't push for those. What was your second question, Alexander?
The second question was whether you think once 5G really becomes rolled out, let's say everywhere, or do you think it significantly increases the attack surface, or is that not such a concern? Or is it, is it too much? The whole 5G topic is dominated by myths and lack of really knowledge and technical understanding.
Well, I think it's exciting, as I mentioned, in terms of the work of the global community working together with GSMA and 3GPP to develop and strengthen the standards and requirements for testing. Because as full 5G moves along, when you get to standalone 5G, as you know, there's certain security enhancements that we'll get the full benefit of as we move into the full 5G. Right now, we have to deal with the traditional security threats, but that will be a different situation when we get to the full 5G. I think there are issues about the attack surface. I think the dependency because of the tremendous benefits that the technologies are going to be bringing, benefiting, reducing the carbon footprint, increasing the efficiency of manufacturing, green energy is going to be helped, the smart farming is going to be, I mean, there are just so many ways that way of lives are going to be affected. And as you use this automation, the sensor to machine communications, they're going to be things that are going to be responding. And so that dependency requires, what I think we're seeing is the collaboration that come up with using principles of zero trust and actual implementations of zero trust and the greater authentication mechanisms are going to help address that greater risk. So I think, yes, there's a larger footprint, particularly with Internet of Things generally, but the greater dependency is something that we have to and we can address this in a comprehensive manner, because this is the kind of stuff that, you know, when I left the White House staff in early 2003, we were talking a good game in the United States about cybersecurity, and in the 26 countries I visited since I joined Huawei, you know, there are different degrees of recognition of the importance of cybersecurity. But as we move into 5G enabled technologies and the greater use of cloud, we see a whole different world where cybersecurity and privacy protection is going to be increasingly important. And so we have to make sure we can address that risk and that there's sufficient transparency and measures and mechanisms for accountability so organizations and individuals can be held accountable if they don't meet their requirements. So that way they're incentivized to meet those requirements.
All right.